Hello everyone, this is Gilgamesh. And today we are going to tackle chapter 9 of Isaiah and the fourth wonderful child. So stick around here and we'll figure out who this fourth wonderful child is. We are going to begin actually with the last verse of chapter 8. As I mentioned before, the chapter and verses are different between the Hebrew tradition and the Christian tradition. And so this is actually verse 1 of chapter 9 in most Christian editions of the Bible. But if you look at a Jewish version of the Bible, this verse is generally attached to the last chapter. And the more I've looked at this section, the more I felt that both are probably wrong, that this seems to be attached to the previous section. And just as a reminder, we were talking in the last section about Isaiah sealing up part of his prophecy and being concerned with the necromancers of his time, that they were looking to the dead for answers. And it talked about these people that lived in shadow and darkness, or were in shadow and darkness, they were dead, and that they couldn't have the power to answer back to these prophets who mutter and peep. So they lived in this shadow land and would look up at the earth and despair. And this is how he saw the dead in relationship to these people who are trying to communicate with them. We read this verse in the last episode here, but there will be no gloom for her who was in anguish. We don't know what it means. It's unfortunately really hard to translate. Both words gloom and anguish there are very rare words that are in this verse here and the previous verse, and that's pretty much it. The word that is translated as gloom looks like it comes from a word that means bird. And so gloom is really only there because of context. It doesn't have anything about the word that really should make it translate that way. Anguish means more of straits or confinement. Really doesn't make a tremendous amount of sense. And then it gives us this mystery part here. In the former time, he brought into contempt the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali. But in the latter time, he has made glorious the way of the sea, the land beyond Jordan, Galilee of the nations. I used a slightly different translation last time. The word here that's brought into contempt means to make light of something. And the phrase here that's translated as made glorious actually means to make something heavy. And so these two are complete opposites, one making light, the other one making heavy. You can also translate them as to make insignificant or to make significant. But unfortunately, we don't know what this is referencing. What was it that was made insignificant or brought into contempt in the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali? We don't know. And then that was something that happened in the past. And then in the later time, presumably the future, something is going to be made significant or possibly even glorious along the way of the sea and the land beyond Jordan. It actually seems to say the other side of Jordan. And it calls that Galilee of the nations. We don't know if this Galilee of the nations is actually the same Galilee that is in existence in the later Second Temple period, also the New Testament times. We don't know that that's the same Galilee as this. This is not a word that occurs often in the Hebrew Bible, and we're not really sure what it's a reference to. So we have two events here that are referenced in this verse, one in the former and one in the latter time. The former event might be the Assyrian invasion of Syria back in 732. Assyria came in and invaded Syria and Israel. And it was in that action that Syria was destroyed and the northern section of Israel were destroyed. Maybe that's what this is referring to, with Zebulun and Naphtali being brought into contempt. Maybe. It's a bit of a stretch. The way of the sea here, we think this is a trade route that was along the Mediterranean coast that runs just south of Mount Carmel and runs through the Galilee. This path would, in fact, lead to the Red Sea at its southern end. This was a path to the Red Sea. Zebulun and Naphtali are actually part of what would be later known as Galilee. And so Galilee is sort of like this larger region. It's not like this is separate from Zebulun and Naphtali. But this idea that something that follows is going to be glorious in the Galilee region and the way of the sea, obviously the Matthew writer in the New Testament saw this as significant, and so he quotes this verse along with the verse that follows as being significant to what he saw happening in his time. But there's really no obvious way to tie this into something contemporary to Isaiah's time, because this whole area was kind of outside the kingdom of Judah and therefore outside of Isaiah's real home. Now, when the Matthew writer does quote this verse, he actually edits out the whole thing about bringing Naphtali and Zebulun into contempt, just skips over that part. But you can find it yourself in Matthew chapter 4, verses 14 through 16, where this is quoted. And interestingly enough, he ends it after the next verse. He doesn't actually bring this fourth wonderful child into his understanding of the meaning of these verses. But what he does bring in is this next verse, which is a great verse. It says, "The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those that dwell in the land of shadow death, on them has the light shone." And I think this is tying into the last chapter where we talked about the dead and how they were trying to talk to the dead who live in this land of darkness. And this would mean that those dead now have seen this great light. What is this? Is this possibly a foreshadowing of resurrection, something that Isaiah does seem to reference in a few places? Hard to say. But these people that are in darkness now have seen a great light. He refers to them as the people living in the land of shadow death. The Hebrew word is salmavet. And the popular interpretation is that this is the two words sal, which means shadow, and mavet, which means death. I just smashed them together to make one word, shadow death. We believe it means some type of hopelessly deep darkness, much darker than the simple hoshek, which is the normal word for darkness, but that this is hopeless darkness, that the people who were in that hopeless darkness now have seen a great light. We are now shifting from the necromancers speaking to the dead who could not provide good answers to now the real answers that are coming from Isaiah as a contrast to that. And if you recall the last chapter, Isaiah said that if they don't agree with what he's written down, look at the sealed portion that he put together. And he said, to the testimony and to the teaching. His sealed portion was supposed to address the truth here and was supposed to stand as a witness of what would happen. And we're now shifting from the failed messages of the necromancers to now these people that walk in darkness, seeing a great light. And what is the great light that comes? It says, "You have multiplied the nation. You have increased its joy. They rejoice before you as with joy at the harvest, and they are glad as when they divide the spoil." Well, let's talk about a few things here. If you look at the King James Version, you will see that this actually has a strange thing here. You have multiplied the nation and not increased the joy. It's a strange statement because it's wrong. The Hebrew word, the negation meaning not, and the phrase "to him" or "to it," there's no it in Hebrew, it's always a him or a her. The not and "to him" are pronounced identically, lo, but they are spelled differently, one being spelled lamed aleph, the other one lamed vav. The phrase that is in the traditional text is the negation, lamed aleph. You have not increased the joy. But it has long been accepted by the Masoretes that this is an error and it should be a vav rather than an aleph there. And it should read, "You have increased the joy to him," meaning the nation. That makes much more sense. You have multiplied the nation, you have increased the joy to it. So that is a better translation of this. And it's just because the King James translators went by the traditional text and were not either aware of or understanding of the marginal notes made by the scribes. Now, there is another fun part of this where people have suggested that maybe the word nation and this word lo should not be read as two separate words, but maybe they should be a single word. Spacing in old texts was very difficult to determine. Sometimes they didn't make clear spacing. They're suggesting that's what happened and that these got understood as two words when they should be a single word. If you put those two words together, it actually forms a word that means rejoicing. And that makes a couple of these lines nicely parallel. And it makes something like a chiasm with three lines in the middle with the words rejoicing and the words joy. You have multiplied the rejoicing, you have enlarged the joy. They joy before you as with joy at the harvest, and they rejoice when they divide the spoil. That is another possible way to correct the text here, but the King James is almost certainly wrong. Now, we should talk a little bit about they rejoice as when they divide the spoil. The word for spoil here is shalal. You might recognize that as the name of Isaiah's second son from the last chapter, the third wonderful child. Interestingly, it looks like the only other time Isaiah uses the phrase divide the spoil, divide the shalal, is in Isaiah 53:12, which is about the suffering servant. And so this is an unusual phrase that occurs only one other time in Isaiah. The two examples he uses here of the type of joy they're having is the joy that comes from harvest and the joy that comes from winning a battle. Much of Isaiah's prophecies are about the Assyrian invasion of Judah. And most of those prophecies deal with that they will lose their agricultural products, that they will no longer have the good of the land, the harvest and so forth, and that there will be an invading army. And these are the two things that he's mentioning here to reverse, that they will indeed have food and that they will indeed survive the battle, that they will be the ones who get to divide the spoil, that as the Assyrians withdraw and flee in terror, that they then move into the Assyrian camps and take their stuff, that they will, instead of being plundered, they get all the free loot. And so that's something you need to understand about this is it's hard for us as moderns to understand how important these things were, but having food and not getting killed were desirable things. And so this is the kind of joy they will have, the joy where, hey, you're not going to starve to death, and hey, you're going to survive the battle. That's the kind of joy that we're talking about here as we look at what this wonderful child, this fourth wonderful child, is going to be involved with. This great light's going to shine. There's going to be joy in the nation. They're going to have food. They're going to survive. That takes us on to our next verse, which is verse 3. For the yoke of his burden and the staff of his shoulder, the rod of his oppressor, you have broken as on the day of Midian. So the day of Midian seems to be a reference to Judges chapter 7, where Gideon defeats the Midianites with a much smaller army. The tone here is one of victory and freedom. They were serving under a yoke, and a yoke, of course, is this thing that you use on oxen, the wooden piece that's placed over their shoulders. And it's said in parallel here, the yoke of his burden and the staff of his shoulder, and they even say the rod of his oppressor. Those three things there you have broken. So the yoke that they were bound to has been smashed or broken. So they are now free of this invader. And then as we go on to verse 4, for every boot stomping with an earthquake, and every garment rolled in blood will be burned as fuel for the fire. Now, the King James Version, again, really messed up this verse. And in fairness, it's a hard verse. We didn't really know the meaning of this verse until we rediscovered the Akkadian language, and then we could make sense of it again. There is this unique phrase, so'on so'in, and this comes from Akkadian and refers to the high-laced boots that the Assyrians wore. It's a cognate accusative. Every boot, booting. We don't have verbs like that in English, but a cognate accusative is where you have your verb and your direct object come from the same root. So you have a verb and a noun that come from the same root. In English, we can say this with things like, I have dreamed a dream. Here they're saying, every boot that booted. And so we can approximate that in translation for every boot stomping. And then this idea that it was so much stomping that it caused the earth to shake. So for every boot stomping with an earthquake is the idea here, this immense army coming in. Now, King James, not knowing what these words meant, they actually went with for every battle of the warrior, just trying to guess from context what it meant, possibly looking at some other translations that were older. The boots that the Assyrians wore have been seen on several surviving reliefs, but we've actually found no actual examples of these boots that have survived. in any kind of archaeological find. The general sense here, though, is that the warrior boots that the Assyrians were famous for, along with all of their blood-stained clothes, all the garments of the warrior that are covered in blood, are all going to be gathered up and just burned in a fire. King James put this together as, "For every battle of the warrior is with confused noise and garments rolled in blood, but this shall be with burning and fuel of fire." There's really hard to get what's happening out of that verse. But what's saying here is that after this invading army comes in and you've survived, you're going to be able to take all their famous boots that they shook the earth with and all of their garments that are covered with the blood of your people and make a giant bonfire out of them. They're done. And you're going to take the weapons and implements of war and just burn them. And so this is the great moment here. With this comes then Isaiah 9:5, or if you're following along in the Christian tradition, it's Isaiah 9:6. "For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, the Mighty God, the Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace." I don't know what happened. That just seems to happen when you read that verse. Okay, so let's take this apart and see what we're saying here about the fourth wonderful child. After freeing the people of this heavy weight under the staff of their shoulder, the yoke that they were with, now this new child, which is clearly a king, takes upon himself the burdens of the people, that he will take their government upon his shoulder. And so he is shouldering the yoke that previously was placed upon the people. So he's taking this burden to himself, acting as a stand-in for his people and carrying their burden for them. Obviously, this was an inspiring verse. George Frederick Handel placed it to music in his oratorio Messiah. The child involved, obviously royal from this and the next verse, where it makes clear that he is a Davidic king. Hezekiah is the obvious choice for what is meant by this child. And that means that this child and the first wonderful child, Emmanuel, might be one and the same. It speaks as though this birth has already occurred. It's not really saying that this is something that will happen. It seems to be saying this is something that did happen. Although I will caution that tense in Hebrew, especially with the prophets, is a little more art than science. As with other names that Isaiah uses for the wonderful children, it is important to look at where else these names are referenced in his writings. So we start with Wonderful Counselor. Probably without the comma, these two words we think went together rather than each one being separate. The Hebrew is Pele Yoetz. And these two words by themselves are each quite common, but put together, they make something a bit more unique. We find them in Isaiah 25, verse 1, where it says, "O Lord, you are my God. I will exalt you. I will praise your name, for you have done wonderful counsels formed of old, faithful and sure." And so here we have this title in reference to the God of Israel, and putting this together that he has done wonderfully and has formed the ancient counsels. We also have these words showing up together in Isaiah chapter 28, verse 29. This also comes from the Lord of hosts. He is wonderful in counsel and excellent in wisdom. So again, these two titles referring to the God of Israel himself. These are magnificent titles to bestow on anyone. It's important to keep in mind that these are divine titles that are being placed upon this Davidic king. Now we go to the next part of the title here, the mighty God. The Hebrew is El Gibor. It can be translated, and perhaps should be translated, as warrior God. Gibor, the word that's translated as mighty, is often used of soldiers, particularly elite soldiers. You may have read about King David's mighty men, the same word. The name of the angel Gabriel, is this same word, but with the words reversed. Instead of El Gibor, it's Gabriel. So same thing, that name probably could translate to warrior of God. The title occurs only one other place in the entire Hebrew Bible, and that is significant because it is also a place where the name of Isaiah's first wonderful child occurs. And that is in Isaiah chapter 10, verse 21. A remnant will return, She'er Yashuv, his first child. A remnant will return, the remnant of Jacob, to El Gibor, to the mighty God. It has to be significant there that two of the wonderful children have their names put together in that verse, showing some sort of a relationship there. What exactly it means? Hard to say. Next part of the title here, the everlasting Father, Avi Ad. This is an interesting title, again, made up of two very common words. But I can't find any other place where they're put together again like this. And the title Everlasting Father, it's never used in the New Testament anywhere. They didn't pick up on this in any way. The word that's translated as everlasting, it's the same spelling as a different word, which could be translated as witness or testimony. Ad being everlasting, ed being witness or testimony, but the same spelling in Hebrew. That word for witness or testimony has been a major word in this section as Isaiah called two men to be witnesses, using this same word, to his writing, and then he bound up the writing, which he referred to as a witness, this same word. So this title could be translated as Father of the Witness. If we read it this way, then the child could be tied up to this sealed prophecy that Isaiah wrote. Certainly seems to make some sense in context. Don't know if that's really the right reading of this or not, but it is a possible reading. We come to the next part of the title here, and that is Prince of Peace. In Hebrew, Sar Shalom. The idea of peace is a constant theme in Isaiah, but this title, Prince of Peace, does not appear anywhere else in the Old Testament, nor does it ever show up in the New Testament. The attribution of this title to Jesus is something that happens after the New Testament. Matthew, when he was quoting this chapter, did not quote from this verse about the wonderful child and did not associate any of these titles with Jesus. The closest we have to a title like this is actually used for Melchizedek, who was the king of Salem. Now, the word Salem, of course, is related to the word Shalom, the king of peace. Sar Shalom, Melech Salem. The thought here is that Salem might be an older name for Jerusalem, or perhaps a shortening of the name Jerusalem. If you look at Jerusalem and you drop off the first four letters, you have Salem, because we think they come from the same root. And that would make a logical sense, since this king of Salem would be a Judaic king, and making the Prince of Peace possibly a reference to the ruler of Jerusalem. That again lines us up well with the idea that this is a Davidic king, that is, this fourth wonderful child. As usual, Isaiah tends to use symbols and sometimes even people as symbols to illustrate his message. Saying that the immediate reference for this child is Hezekiah does not in any way negate additional layers of meaning that might be intended for it. It's often a really bad idea to limit the reach of a prophet's words. We don't know what exactly he had in mind. But if we're trying to ground it in the time and place where he was, Hezekiah seems like the logical person for this child to be. And if there's any doubt that he is a Davidic king, let's see what happens in verse 6. Of the increase of his government and of peace, there will be no end. On the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and to uphold it with justice and with righteousness from this time forth and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this. Several elements to talk about in this verse. It reflects the names that were just given for the child, although it may not be totally obvious in translation. government is actually from the same root word as the word for prince, and the word for peace shows up here as well. The idea that they will be without end, this phrase without end, actually becomes a fairly significant name of God in post-biblical times. This government and peace will be without end. And then we have the themes of justice and righteousness mentioned. Justice being the Hebrew word mishpat, and righteousness being the Hebrew word tzedakah. These are two of Isaiah's favorite words, and he constantly uses them for his ideal society, one that can ensure justice and righteousness. And again, we have this idea of an eternal government here from this time forth and forevermore. The word that's translated as forevermore contains the word that was translated as everlasting in everlasting Father. So if you prefer it to mean everlasting Father, this is a note in that favor that we do seem to be leaning into that meaning of the name rather than Father of the witness by this part of the verse. So there's a little bit of evidence on both sides. Then the last part here, the zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this. The word translated as zeal here is the Hebrew word kana. It is the same word that is translated elsewhere as jealousy. It's a difficult word to understand. Neither jealousy nor zeal really captures it. It is spoken of as something the Lord has, as well as something that his followers have for him. The word can be used both in positive and negative context. Strong emotions or maybe passion might be the best approximation for it. It does have a family relationship to it, that this is the feeling that a husband will feel towards his wife as he gets protective of her, not wanting her to stray and so forth. This is that same word, but it doesn't seem to be that simple. Now, of course, one of the titles of God given famously in the Ten Commandments is Elkanah, jealous God. For the Lord your God is Elkanah. We don't know exactly what that means. It may not be as simple as it appears. It might have been a proper name going to some particular root that might mean this word, jealousy, or it might mean something more than that. We just don't know. That's an area where there's a lot of disagreement still as to exactly what it means. We have the idea here that the government's going to last forever and that it will be the Lord of hosts, that's his military title, the Lord of armies. His passion or his deep feelings is what's going to cause this to last forever. Unlike the last three of the wonderful children, there is no clear tie in this fourth wonderful child to the events of Syria and Israel invading Judah. Instead, there seems to be more of an association with the showdown with Assyria that's going to happen in 701 BC. So this seems to be a little different than the other three children that mostly were tied more to that moment that was 30 some odd years earlier than this, that had Israel's northern neighbors right at their door and causing King Ahaz such consternation. This one seems to be much more forward-looking to 701 BC, where Hezekiah, as an adult, will be king in the city and will be able to withstand the assault from the Assyrians. And so this actually ends the fourth wonderful child section, and now we have discussed all four of the wonderful child. What follows after this seems to be a new poem, and it even has a special refrain to it that we'll look at. This actually probably would have been a better spot to put the end of a chapter, honestly. And so we're going to end this session here, and next time we will pick it up with the poem that follows. Hope you enjoyed this. Click the like button, click the subscribe button. We'll see you in the next one.